Every zombie show has rules about how to survive. Fear. The Walking Dead has those same rules, but somehow nobody follows them. From basic stealth failures to abandoning the most defensible positions imaginable, these survivors make choices that would get them killed in the first 5 minutes of any real outbreak. Today we're breaking down every major survival mistake in the series, and trust me, the final one is completely unforgivable. First things first, let's talk about the most basic rule they refuse to learn: making noise in zombie territory. Walkers are attracted to sound. This is established fact in the Walking Dead universe, confirmed across multiple series, multiple communities, and multiple near-death experiences. Loud noises pull infected toward the source, creating massive concentrations of undead that are almost impossible to escape. So naturally, Fear the Walking Dead characters spend most of their time shouting, firing unsuppressed weapons, and generally behaving like they're at a carnival instead of navigating an extinction-level event. Here's the thing. These aren't people fresh out of civilization. By the time we reach locations like Broke Jaw Ranch or Gonzales Dam, survivors have been living with walkers for months or years. They know exactly what happens when you make noise in the wrong place, and they do it anyway. Take La Colonia, a hillside community in Tijuana that uses a fenced mass of infected as a literal defensive wall. The colony neighbors a corralled herd that responds to sound. One shouted argument near the perimeter and that entire defensive structure collapses inward. Irrational leadership would enforce whisper protocols in outer zones and treat gunfire like a last resort. Instead, characters move in and out with casual noise levels, as if the wall is a decoration rather than a living minefield. Even Daniel Salazar, a man with documented combat experience in the Salvadoran conflict who later runs security at Gonzales Dam, never institutionalizes noise discipline. For someone managing a critical resource node with armed personnel, it's bizarre that his operations default to loud engagements without any visible risk calculus. The inconsistency is the real killer. Sometimes the show treats noise as an existential threat, with characters creeping through buildings and whispering urgently. Other times they fire automatic weapons in urban canyons like they're calling in an airstrike for fun. If the characters don't behave as if sound reliably draws walkers, why should the audience believe it does? At least they're making noise in relatively open areas, though, unlike the people who think a thin cotton shirt is adequate protection against bites. Wearing zero bite protection. Everyone in Fear the Walking Dead knows exactly how walkers kill you. One bite, you're dead, not injured, not sick, dead. And yet, years into the apocalypse, survivors are still wandering around in t-shirts and jeans like they're headed to a farmer's market. We're talking about people who have watched friends die from bites, who clear walkers daily, who understand the exact mechanics of infection, and who still refuse to wrap a single layer of duct tape around their forearms. The logic breaks down fast when you consider what's available. At Gonzales Dam, Daniel Salazar guides Strand through a warehouse packed with vehicles. You know what cars have? Seat covers, carpeting, leather interiors, plastic panels, all of which can be stripped and tied into forearm guards in about 10 minutes. A single SUV could armor an entire squad. Yet Daniel, who has survived torture, warfare, and multiple apocalypses, walks around with bare skin exposed like he's immune to basic physics. For a man whose entire backstory is calculated survival, that's baffling. Broke Jaw Ranch makes it worse. This is a community with a militia mindset, stockpiled weapons, ranch equipment, and presumably workshops. Ranchers routinely wear protective gear against animals and machinery. Adapting that logic to walkers should be instinctive. Instead, defenders face hordes in ordinary clothing, as if bite-resistant gear never crossed anyone's mind. When the ranch falls, partly due to a massive herd weaponized by Troy Otto, you genuinely have to wonder how many deaths a pair of thick gloves could have prevented. The fan community has been calling this out for years. Some try to rationalize it by arguing that armor limits mobility or causes overheating in the Texas heat, and there's some truth to that, but it doesn't justify zero armor. A realistic portrayal would show survivors negotiating the trade-off: heavier protection for dangerous missions, lighter gear during downtime. The show's failure to depict this creates a world where people who fully understand that one bite kills still treat exposure as an acceptable daily risk, which is, not ideal. By the later seasons, when characters like Alicia have spent years fighting walkers, the continued absence of armor stops being early apocalypse naivety and becomes glaring tactical absurdity. In a world where one mistake ends you, refusing to protect yourself isn't scrappy or brave, it's just dumb. At least they're not actively trying to get bitten, unlike the people who stick around in radiation zones, but we'll get to that nightmare next. Leaving perfect vehicles struggles behind. The Gonzales Dam Vehicle Warehouse is one of the most embarrassing missed opportunities in Fear the Walking Dead, and the show never really acknowledges it. Here's the thing. That compound had trucks, multiple trucks, fuel stores, the physical infrastructure of a serious logistics operation, and the group essentially treated it like a parking lot they happened to sleep near. Think about the mobility math for a second. A person on foot covers maybe 3 miles an hour on a good day, on good terrain, without anything chasing them. A truck covers that same distance in under 3 minutes. That's not a minor advantage. That's the difference between reacting to a crisis and never being in one in the first place. The group at the dam had access to that gap and kept choosing not to use it, which is the kind of decision that makes you want to reach through the screen. Broke Jaw Ranch compounds this problem because it should have known better. This is a survivalist compound. These are people who, by design, prepared for exactly this kind of collapse. A formalized vehicular doctrine should have been one of the first things they established, right alongside food rationing and perimeter security. Who has keys to what? Who authorizes a run? Fuel accounting. Basic stuff. Instead, vehicles at Brokejaw get used whenever the plot needs someone to be somewhere and forgotten whenever the plot needs someone to be stranded. The fuel writing is where the internal logic fully collapses. Fuel scarcity gets treated as a crisis when the episode needs tension and quietly disappears when the characters need to cover ground. There's no consistent logic to it, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The show is essentially using fuel as an emotional dial, rather than a resource with actual constraints. But the sharpest critique here is about the antagonists. The groups that consistently threaten and outmaneuver the protagonists throughout the series are, almost without exception, groups that use vehicles effectively. They patrol, they coordinate, they control territory through mobility. The protagonists keep getting caught flat-footed, kept vulnerable, and the show frames this as dramatic tension when it's actually just artificial incompetence. The writers needed the heroes in danger, so the heroes forgot how to do the obvious thing again. The result is a show that inadvertently makes its villains look competent by comparison, not because they're smarter or more ruthless, but because they understand that in a world without infrastructure, the person with a working truck and a full tank owns the road, which is, not ideal for a group that had an entire warehouse full of them. Mismanaging infinite natural resources. The group spends multiple seasons living next to literal rivers, sitting on top of a dam that controls all the water in Tijuana, and occupying a ranch with hundreds of acres of arable land. And somehow, they still run out of food and water like they're stranded in the middle of the Sahara. Before you assume I'm exaggerating, let me be clear. These people had access to a functioning hydroelectric dam with a warehouse full of vehicles and a controlled water distribution network that supplied an entire region. They also held Brokejaw Ranch, a property with livestock infrastructure and enough land to sustain small-scale agriculture for years. And La Colonia, a hillside community with a medical center and a strategic walker barrier. These weren't temporary camps. These were locations built to last, and every single one collapsed because nobody could think past next week. Take Gonzales Dam. This facility had the infrastructure to distribute water across Tijuana, making whoever controlled it the most powerful entity in the region. Dante Esquivel used water as leverage to control survivors. Daniel Salazar later became chief of security, meaning this was a staffed, defended stronghold with vehicles and trade potential. In any realistic scenario, the people running this facility would be investing in maintenance, cultivating alliances, and trading water for food and medicine. Instead, Dante ran it like a dictatorship until someone blew the whole thing up. The explosion of a functioning dam in a desert region during an apocalypse is not a tragic inevitability. It's a failure of leadership so severe it borders on satire. Brokejaw Ranch had a similar problem with different resources. The ranch had land, livestock potential, armed residents, and existing supply chains. It was positioned in open country with clear sightlines. The Otto family had weapons, fuel, and a militia culture. With proper leadership, this could have been a regional hub. Instead, they spent their time nursing grudges against the nation and hoarding power until Troy Otto, their own exiled psychopath, weaponized a massive herd and destroyed the entire ranch. They had hundreds of acres and a fortified perimeter, and they lost it because they couldn't stop fighting over pride long enough to secure a harvest. La Colonia is even worse because it had the blueprint for sustainable defense. The community used a fenced area filled with infected as a living barrier, creating a moat that deterred human attackers without requiring constant patrols. This is one of the smartest defensive innovations in the entire series. Add a hillside position, a medical center, and a functioning market, and you have the foundation for a genuinely resilient settlement. But Alejandro Núñez got so wrapped up in his messianic immunity narrative that he failed to prepare for external threats. When the cartel came, the colony had no evacuation plan, no redundant water sources, and no diplomatic strategy. They just abandoned a fortified position that could have supported dozens of people for years. The pattern is consistent. Every time the group gains access to abundant resources, they treat it like a temporary rest stop instead of a permanent foundation. Nobody plants crops expecting to harvest them. Nobody builds cisterns. Nobody organizes trade routes. They sit on top of infinite resources, burn through stockpiles, and leave when things get hard. It's the survival equivalent of winning the lottery and spending it all on lottery tickets. If you think mismanaging dams and ranches is bad, at least they didn't actively trust the guy who would later destroy everything. Oh wait, trusting obvious psychopaths. Madison Clark is supposed to be a hardened survivor who does whatever it takes to protect her family, but she keeps one person close who literally experiments on living people for fun and somehow thinks that'll work out fine. Before you say I'm exaggerating, hear me out. Troy Otto shows up at Brokejaw Ranch and immediately starts doing things that would get him ejected from any rational community within the first hour. He conducts brutal experiments on refugees. He's openly fascinated with watching people turn into walkers. He treats violence like a hobby, and Madison sees all of this, acknowledges it's disturbing, and then decides the best move is to keep him around as an ally because he knows the land. The guy who tortures people, that guy. Here's where it gets worse. Madison eventually exiles Troy after he becomes too much of a liability, which sounds responsible until you realize what exile actually means here. You're releasing a violent, vengeful individual who knows every detail about your defenses, supply routes, and weak points, and you're assuming he'll quietly disappear into the wasteland. That's not tactical oversight. That's tactical suicide. Troy doesn't disappear. He tracks a massive herd of walkers and leads them directly to Brokejaw Ranch, destroying the entire settlement, a defensible location with real resources and infrastructure. Gone, because Madison chose to exile a known psychopath instead of removing the threat permanently. One decision, one person, entire community gone. And Troy isn't even the only example. Dante Esquivel runs Gonzales Dam like a feudal warlord, rationing water to coerce people and brutalizing anyone who steps out of line. Daniel Salazar spots the threat immediately, but the group still operates within Dante's system far too long, waiting for the inevitable revolt instead of planning a cleaner transition. By the time they act, the dam's already destabilized and the whole operation collapses in violence. The pattern repeats. Clearly dangerous people get welcomed in, red flags get ignored, and the group acts shocked when betrayal follows. From a security standpoint, this is where Fear the Walking Dead completely abandons logic. In any high-stakes environment, leaders vet new people obsessively. They watch for warning signs. They isolate unpredictable individuals. Troy exhibits every predictable marker of a violent escalator: fascination with death, lack of empathy, pleasure and suffering. Any competent leadership would have recognized him as a ticking bomb and contained the threat early. Instead, Madison treats him like a volatile but manageable asset, and the entire ranch pays the price. What makes this even more absurd is that these are supposedly seasoned survivors. They've lived through years of the apocalypse. They've seen betrayals. They know what happens when you trust the wrong person, and yet they keep doing it, letting clearly unstable individuals into their inner circles because those people are useful short-term, then acting surprised when the long-term cost is catastrophic. At least Madison's mistakes with Troy eventually teach her something about vetting allies. Unlike the next problem, where entire communities collapse because people would rather settle old grudges than survive the apocalypse. Ego problems. Here's the thing about surviving the apocalypse. The zombies are not actually your biggest problem. The zombies are slow, predictable, and fundamentally stupid. They will walk into a wall repeatedly until something more interesting happens. What kills you in Fear the Walking Dead, over and over again, is the person standing next to you who can't let something go. Ego-driven conflict is the single greatest survival mistake this show has to offer, and it plays out so consistently you start to wonder if the writers had a grudge against the concept of cooperation. Take Brokejaw Ranch. The Otto family and Kalataka Walkers Nation are locked in a land dispute that, in literally any functional society, would get resolved by a lawyer and some paperwork. Post-apocalypse, With the dead walking around eating people, the correct answer is obvious. Share the land, share the resources, survive together. Instead, what you get is months of escalating tension, sabotage, psychological warfare, and eventually enough bloodshed to depopulate both groups significantly. The ranch had walls, water, and defensible ground. Walker's people had numbers and knowledge of the terrain. Together, they were genuinely formidable. Apart, they were a slow-motion disaster waiting for a spark. The spark arrived, naturally, right on schedule. And then there's Troy Otto, who is perhaps the clearest example of what happens when ego overrides every tactical instinct Madison Clark supposedly had. Troy is dangerous. Troy is unstable. Troy has demonstrated on multiple occasions the exact kind of erratic behavior that gets entire groups killed. Madison knows this. Everyone knows this. The show knows this. And yet the decision made, repeatedly, is to manage Troy rather than neutralize the threat he represents. The reasoning is some combination of loyalty, utility, and the deeply human but deeply stupid belief that you can control a person who has already shown you exactly who they are. You cannot. Troy eventually does exactly what Troy was always going to do, and people die because the harder decision got avoided for too long. But the real crown jewel of ego-driven catastrophe is the Gonzalez Dam. Stop and think about what that dam actually represents in a post-collapse world. A reliable, renewable power source, a massive water supply, and one of the most structurally defensible positions you could possibly hope to control. It is, functionally, the most valuable piece of real estate in the region, the kind of asset that rational actors would protect at almost any cost. What happens to it? It gets destroyed, not by a massive enemy force, not by some unavoidable catastrophe. It gets destroyed because the people controlling it could not work out their power struggle long enough to protect the thing that was keeping them all alive. The dam goes, and with it goes every strategic advantage it represented. Then you have Daniel Salazar and Victor Strand, two of the most individually capable characters in the show's entire run. Daniel is a trained intelligence operative who has survived things most people couldn't imagine. Strand is a resourceful, ruthless, and genuinely clever operator who has talked his way out of situations that should have killed him 3 times over. Together, these two should be an extraordinary survival asset. What they actually are is a mutual destruction machine, betraying each other in rotating cycles until whatever goodwill or cooperation might have existed between them is completely gone. Group cohesion is not a social nicety. It is a tactical necessity. Every grudge you carry, every power play you make, every conflict you choose over compromise is a direct subtraction from your survival odds. Fear the Walking Dead builds its entire tragedy on that one stubborn, very human refusal to accept it. Staying in highly toxic radiation zones, nuclear radiation is invisible, odorless, and will kill you slowly while you pretend everything's fine. Yet, Fear the Walking Dead's characters treat fallout zones like slightly inconvenient neighborhoods where you just need to hold your breath and walk quickly. Spoiler alert, that's not how radiation works. Here's the thing. In actual nuclear disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima, authorities evacuate entire regions permanently. Decades later, those zones are still cordoned off because radiation doesn't just go away when you want it to. The exposure causes cancer, organ damage, and immune suppression, which in a world with limited medical care and constant injuries is basically signing your own death certificate with extra steps. But in Fear, survivors waltz into compromised reactor sites, set up camp near warheads that have gone critical, and treat Geiger counter readings like weather reports instead of evacuation orders. The justification is usually something like radiation keeps other groups away, or there are supplies nobody else will claim. Cool. You know what else keeps people away? Being dead from acute radiation syndrome. Because that's what happens when you stay in a hot zone long enough. Your cells stop dividing correctly, your bone marrow shuts down, and you start bleeding from places you shouldn't. The survivors already face walkers, starvation, and hostile humans. Adding cumulative radiation exposure to that list is like playing Russian roulette while juggling chainsaws. Completely unnecessary and impressively stupid. Real responders in contaminated zones follow time-distance shielding principles. Spend as little time as possible in the area. Stay as far from the source as you can. Put concrete or lead between you and the radiation. They rotate personnel, use dosimeters to track exposure, and decontaminate rigorously after every shift. Fear's characters do none of this. They walk through ashen landscapes in regular clothes, handle irradiated walkers with bare hands, and track fallout dust into their living spaces like it's ordinary dirt. The infected themselves are walking biohazards now, covered in radioactive particles that should warrant specialized tactics like extended reach weapons and disposable protective layers. Instead, survivors stab them up close and personal, because apparently nobody told them that getting walker blood mixed with cesium-137 on your skin is a bad time. What makes this even more absurd is that safer alternatives exist. The apocalypse has emptied out most of the map. There are entire states, entire countries with zero radiation where you could set up without slowly cooking your DNA. But no, characters stay in contaminated zones because the plot needs them there, not because any rational human being would make that choice. In reality, even incomplete relocation beats sheltering in a fallout plume. You leave, you walk, you find literally anywhere else. The idea that a defensible reactor site or a cache of supplies is worth years of exposure is the kind of short-term thinking that gets everyone sick and dead before they realize the mistake. The irony is that fear tries to frame these zones as a thematic statement about humanity's hubris, that our pre-apocalypse technology came back to haunt us. And visually, ruined reactors and ghost towns work, but the characters' decisions ruin the premise. If the radiation is severe enough to create diseased walkers and unstable infrastructure, then any survivor group without hazmat suits and nuclear engineering degrees should be sprinting in the opposite direction. Choosing to stay is trading a slow, invisible death for temporary shelter, which makes no sense when you've already survived years of learning to respect every other danger in this world. At least you can see a walker coming. But if you think living in a radiation zone is the worst decision the survivors make, wait until you hear about the time they abandoned a fortified military sanctuary that had everything they needed to survive. Indefinitely abandoning fortified military sanctuaries. The single dumbest pattern in Fear the Walking Dead is how every time the characters find a defensible location with resources, they either destroy it or walk away from it for reasons that make zero tactical sense. We're talking about places with walls, water, weapons, and storage, the exact combination you need to survive long term. And every single time, the show engineers a collapse that could have been avoided with basic strategic thinking. Broke Jaw Ranch is the clearest example. This place has land, livestock potential, armed residents, established fences, and a militia culture. It's open terrain with clear lines of sight for miles. You can see threats coming. You have housing, storage, and a community structure already in place. In a real survival scenario, this is a location you fortify and defend with everything you have. But the Ottos refuse to integrate the native group trying to reclaim ancestral land. Madison chooses sides instead of forcing compromise. And Troy Otto comes back with a massive herd and destroys the entire ranch as revenge. The ranch doesn't fall to an overwhelming external force. It falls because the leadership prioritized grudges over collective defense. They had the resources, the people, and the position. They just didn't have the discipline to preserve it. La Colonia is another fortress that gets abandoned for no good reason. It's built into a hillside in Tijuana with natural defensive advantages. It has a medical center, housing, and most impressively, a wall made of infected that acts as a living barrier against human attackers. That's an incredibly sophisticated defensive innovation. The infected are literally working for you, deterring raids while you manage your community behind them. And yet, Alejandro Nunez's messianic leadership turns rigid. He refuses to adapt when the cartel threat escalates, and ultimately the colony is abandoned, even though the infrastructure itself remains intact. They didn't lose the fortifications. They chose to leave them behind. A more pragmatic leadership could have negotiated with external threats and turned La Colonia into a durable enclave. Instead, they walked away from a hillside fortress with its own zombie moat because their leader couldn't see past his own ideology. Then there's Gonzales Dam. This one hurts the most because it's not just a fortified position, it's critical infrastructure. The dam controls freshwater distribution to the entire region, which in a collapse scenario makes it more valuable than gold. Whoever holds the dam holds leverage over every survivor within 100 miles. It's concrete with limited access points, guards, and the potential for power generation. Daniel Salazar becomes chief of security there, which tells you the place has real organizational capacity. But Dante Esquivel runs it like a dictatorship, using water as coercion. That breeds resentment and turns a sanctuary into a target. When conflict erupts, the dam gets blown up. A functioning hydroengineering facility, destroyed because the people controlling it couldn't see the value of coalition building over authoritarian rule. The explosion destabilizes the entire surrounding region, cutting off water to communities that depended on it. One bad governance model erases a sanctuary that could have anchored stability for decades. The pattern is consistent. Every fortified location is lost not because it's indefensible, but because the people inside sabotage their own position. Brokejaw Ranch had the militia but couldn't integrate allies or eliminate threats. La Colonia had the terrain but couldn't transition from messianic leadership to pragmatic governance. Gonzales Dam had the water but couldn't shift from coercion to cooperation. In each case, alternative strategies existed: power-sharing agreements, formalized alliances, fair resource distribution. None of these are fantasy solutions, but Fear the Walking Dead doesn't allow for that evolution. The show is committed to collapse. Every sanctuary burns, floods, or falls to a herd, and the survivors move on to start from scratch somewhere else, which means they never accumulate knowledge, never build institutions, and never develop resilient infrastructure. From a military strategy perspective, this is insane. You don't abandon or destroy your own fortresses in the middle of a war of attrition. The correct strategy is to fortify, repair, and adapt, not blow everything up and wander into the next season homeless. The worst part is that the characters clearly understand the value of these places. Madison drives to the dam specifically because she knows it's strategic. Daniel takes the security role because he understands infrastructure matters. The Ottos built the ranch as a prepper stronghold because they knew fortified positions would be critical. They all know what they're supposed to do. They just don't do it. They let personal vendettas, ideological purity, and short-term wins override the most fundamental rule of survival. When you find something defensible and resource-rich, you hold it. Not all stories have a point. Sometimes they're just a series of avoidable disasters from beginning to end. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.